Okay, we are entering Paul's letters, Pauline letters. Paul writes a lot of letters to a lot of people, and it makes up a big chunk of the New Testament. So, we are going to talk a little bit about those letters over the next however many videos that I make. There are three main themes to Paul's letters. God, what is Jesus, God's people, and God's future. Now, we've talked a little bit about this, but I, again, want you to think about the fact that Paul was a Pharisee. He was sort of the best of the best in terms of Jews. He was of the highest order. He was always purified. He was the man in terms of being Jewish. So Paul never thought for a minute, never ever in his life, that he wasn't going to heaven. So when Paul met Jesus on the Damascus Road, he had a completely life-altering experience, right? Changed his whole life. That wasn't because he didn't think he was going to heaven before and he now thought he was going to heaven. It wasn't because he didn't like sacrificing small animals and now he doesn't have to do that. His whole idea is that heaven has come to earth. The Messiah has come. The Messiah has come to save us all right now, right here on earth today. Not fire insurance when you die. Okay, so just like, right, that's what we're doing. Okay, so Paul's letters. Paul writes letters to a lot of different people on a lot of different topics. So he had missionary journeys where he would go and he would plant churches at these places. He worked as a tent maker, so he would probably go into an area and just work making tents. And meanwhile, he would spread the gospel message. And he would get to know people, and he would start a church, and he would set it up, and he would be there for a couple of years, and then he would go on to the next city. Meanwhile, while he was somewhere else at the next city, he would write letters to the previous churches that he had set up, that he was friends with, his coworkers, his friends, his church. Okay? Again, three main themes, if you keep in mind these letters. Okay, so Romans, the book of Romans. Possibly thought to be one of Paul's most profound writing, and this was, guess what? To Rome. So he names them by where he's sending them. Crazy! Again, often thought to be Paul's most profound, deepest thinking, if you must. Martin Luther called it the purest gospel. The greatest revivals and reformations throughout the history of Christianity have resulted from reading the book of Romans or an increased or new understanding of the book of Romans. So Romans is kind of a big deal. Okay, sorry, I keep saying The main issue here is judgment and sin. How can a righteous God judge all people, and does not sin condemn us with no hope? So, and this definitely leads you to that Jewish understanding of there's no way you can save yourself. Only God's grace can save you. But if God's grace saves you, should you just run around committing sin willy-nilly? No to both of those things. Paul is like, God is a righteous judge because he understands what's the motivation, what's actually going on in your heart, what you're actually thinking when you're doing things. So in some cases, you can just be setting and having evil thoughts versus somebody who's doing something that everyone else would presume to be evil, but actually isn't because God knows your thoughts. So he is really the only person available for judgment because he knows all. So there is no sin, condemnation with no hope. He points us to Jesus, this Messiah, right? He's like, listen, Jesus has come. He is the Messiah. We are saved by grace. It doesn't mean that the gospel is just fire insurance. Fire insurance is what I say, like you are a Christian just so you won't go to hell. It's also called Pascal's wager. And Pascal says it like this: if you are a Christian and it turns out that you're wrong, you haven't really lost anything, right? You lived a Christian life and then you die and there's nothing afterwards. So there's nothing really lost. But if you're not a Christian and you were wrong and there is a God and you end up in hell, that's a lot to wager. So just in case, you might as well be a Christian in the off chance that Christianity is right. This is a terrible theology, and no one really wants to live their life like this way. Also, more modern terminology is fire insurance. You're just going to heaven so that you don't burn in hell. And really, Paul is saying in all of his Gospels, that's not what this is about. This is about being able to live and talk to God now. God is available to help you now, to comfort you now on earth. So Romans is to give you hope in the future. This is what I was saying before. Paul really believed he was going to heaven. He wanted heaven to come to earth. The promised Messiah and the Holy Spirit right now, available to all who believed, not just fire insurance. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. So it's really weird, actually, that he's the apostle to the Gentiles, because I just said he's like the most Jewish of the Jews, and we sent him out to the Gentiles. He's super Jewish. But what he did is in every city that he went to, he of course went to the Jewish temple first and really made a huge effort to try and convert Jews. And in most cases he did convert Jews, but he really ended up being the apostle to the Gentiles, which is a testament to God working in his heart to change how he felt about Gentiles. Because he was Jewish, he probably didn't like Gentiles. So, he was also born a Roman citizen, which comes up several times and is kind of a big deal. It's like he has certain rights, alienable rights, because he is in fact a Jewish citizen. Paul's two main achievements overall are he wrote 13 books of the New Testament, which is a lot. He was the primary leader of the church in Asia Minor and in Greece, and a fearless champion and church planter. So the spread of Christianity was primarily Paul, quite honestly. Paul went and set up these churches. Again, he was a tent maker, so he would go, he would make tents. He would, meet in the community in the evenings or when he wasn't making tents, and he sort of set up all of these little churches all over. Also, Paul was eventually under house arrest in Rome the first time and was released. After he was released, he was a vigorous missionary to churches because he sort of knew that he was going to get arrested again, so he wanted to make the best of that situation. And while he was either a missionary or in jail, he was corresponding with his churches that he planted. He was under house arrest again in Rome the second time and wrote to his churches often. He was under house arrest for, they think, 2 to 3 years in Rome and eventually beheaded in Rome. So during that time, he wrote lots of letters to his churches to sort of be their pastor from jail. Again, the book of Romans, specifically, now we're talking about the book of Romans, written to believers in Rome, which at the time was the largest, most important city in the world. A large, again, population of slaves, poor, and disenfranchised. So you could definitely get a sense of that as he's writing. He's writing about hope. He's writing about hope right now. Not just like, hey, your life is really terrible, but the good news is when you die, you're going to go to heaven. That's not necessarily his message. His message is more, hey, your life is not great. Jesus does actually love you. He suffered just the way you suffered and wants to make your life better. If nothing else, just comforting you in the station of which you have found yourself. Paul's letters are the most common literary form in the New Testament. So the letter writing is the most common form that you'll see. The style here is part literary production, part everyday conversation. So he has a very conversational tone, but it's also, right, a conversational tone of somebody that is like a grammar Nazi, right? He writes very well, but it's also conversational. He's talking to his friends in the churches that he has planted. They all begin with his name and some designation, to the Church of Corinth, to the Church of Rome, to the Church of Philippi. The body of the letter presents both theological and practical concerns like, hey, you need to stop sleeping with your stepmom, and also love your neighbor, and also don't exclude people from communion, and also don't drink at communion. Like, the communion is not for you to just get drunk. Communion is for you to worship, right? So practical things and bigger theology things. Okay. next video.